So today is a day to have appreciation. And what I want to share with you is the idea that maybe there's some things that we could appreciate about this one that was called Jesus of Nazareth. But I kind of have to set this up a little bit first. First, I want to just draw your attention to the photograph that's on the screen there. Isn't that amazing? That statue is 100 feet tall. And the pedestal under it is like 26 feet. It's monstrous. And anywhere in the city of Rio de Janeiro, you can see that thing sitting up there on that mountain. It's very impressive. Obviously, the people of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil think a lot of this one named Jesus of Nazareth. And I did growing up. I grew up in a very traditional Christian family, but I had a little weirdness around my take on it. I required of my parents and siblings that they listen to me read the Christmas story from the Gospels before any presents were opened. I was never popular on Christmas. But my point is this is supposed to be to celebrate the birth of Jesus, right? That's what we're here to do. And then I found out a lot about it isn't so at all. They say that, we set this date, Christmas, the 25th of December, and say that it was the birth of Jesus. All the Roman records, because his parents traveled from their home in Nazareth to a little town called Bethlehem, is how the story goes, and that was because they were born in this little village of Bethlehem, and they had to pay their taxes. Well, all the records of the Roman Empire showed that taxes were collected in the summer. So chances are, if that story is at all valid, he was born in the summer. Different. Now, there's other things about his life that are just a little hard to explain. One is that he was said to be the son of the Jewish deity Jehovah, and yet there was this guy Joseph who his mother Mary referred to him as his father. So one of those is true or the other. And I have to tell you, this idea of being the child of a deity wasn't a fresh idea at the time. All of the Greek gods, had fathers, and Zeus was the main god of the Roman Empire, and he all his children were these other gods. Yet we've got this guy Jesus who is said to have been born to Mary, who was said to be a virgin. And actually, there were other stories about virgins at the time giving birth. So all of it's a little sketchy. And then you go to his name. Well, the word Jesus comes out of the Greek, and he wasn't Greek. He was Hebrew. And there were other people named Jesus, named Yeshua. Yeshua was his actual name. And his name is actually said to be Yeshua ben Joseph, which is Yeshua, son of Joseph, because that's the way they named people back then. And it was, years later by people that didn't know him at all that decided to call him Jesus of Nazareth. And it was clearly Paul who decided to call him Christ, who brought that into it. And as we know, his parents were not Joseph and Mary Christ. So that was not his name. That was a way of just honoring his presence. And we've kind of evolved from that, especially in our movement, to say that this idea of the Christ is a statement of our divinity. And that's fine, and that kind of works for us. And we're going to do that on Christmas Eve here. We're all going to pass the light of the Christ. We call it the Christ candle, and we light it, and we've spread that light across the room with the phrase, "The Christ in me honors the Christ in you." So that kind of balances all of that out. But these things that weren't necessarily clear points about the life of Jesus, make the whole idea of who he was, or even if he really existed, a little confusing, a little uncertain. However, there must be something about this guy who lived 2,000 years ago that has had an amazing influence on the Western world, and not just the Western world, but many parts of Asia. In fact, Christianity is the largest faith on the planet. So there's got to be something there so that we don't think this is all just fraud. This is all made up stuff. There's got to be something there that makes this worth experiencing. So I want us to take a shot at understanding who this man was. And I'm going to call him Jesus today because that's just easier. But what I've learned through my research is that he actually had some influences that I had no idea about. And I got really excited to hear about this. So again, my point today is not so much to give you something to change your life, but maybe an opportunity to appreciate this thing we call Christmas and why we go to all the trouble that we do of experiencing this thing and why it's worthwhile to at least connect a thought about this man and who he was in the world. So I have actually 6 areas to talk to you about. And we're going to start and these are things that Jesus actually had an influence on changing the way humanity deals with certain things. And the first one we're going to talk about is children. Well, now you know that he said that we need to have a mind like a child to enter the kingdom of heaven. And he said heaven was not a place far away, but that heaven was a state of consciousness, a state of mind. So to be in that blissful state of mind that was called heaven, or the kingdom of heaven, was to be like a child. But he didn't stop there. He loved the children. Now, in the ancient world, you may not know this, but children were not particularly valued. I'm sure you've heard of the stories of kings and emperors putting out a decree to kill all the children below the age of 2, for example. That happened many times. It's in the story of Moses. It's actually in the story of Jesus that Jesus and his family had to escape to Egypt to avoid having him killed. Now it's kind of interesting that he would be the only 12-year-old around when he got to that age, but all of that doesn't matter. The idea is that children were not appreciated, and that by his setting the example of loving the children and paying attention to the children changed the mindset of his culture and ultimately the mindset of this thing called the Christian faith, to where children were appreciated. They were honored. It was different from the time when you had as many kids as you could because many of them wouldn't survive, and you now could focus on truly loving your children and helping them grow into meaningful adults, having meaningful lives. There was a Norwegian scholar named Bach that made a study on the impact of Jesus' teachings around children. He said that through the teachings of Jesus, children became people. Isn't that interesting? Children became people. And that childhood became the valued aspect of the human experience. Wow, Jesus did that through his teachings, and his love of children impacted all the generations since by helping us to know how important children are. Pretty big, huh? Yeah, how about that? The next one to talk about is education. Jesus loved education. In fact, but even in the ancient culture, they loved education. It's just that it was only for the elite, for the high class to have an education, to be able to read and to be able to experience books. That was not something that common people did. They were illiterate. Most people on the planet were illiterate, except a few that could afford to have these handwritten books, because back then all the books were written by hand. But there's a story that goes with this, and it comes out of the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 39 through 47. I'm going to share this with you. They returned from Galilee to their home in Nazareth. The boy grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. And his people went every year to Jerusalem during the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to the feast as they were accustomed. And when the feast days were over, they returned, but the boy Jesus remained in Jerusalem. and Joseph and his mother did not know it. They thought that he was with the children in their party, and when they went on a day's journey, they sought him out among the other people and those who knew him, but they could not find him. So they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, listening to them, asking and answering questions. And all those who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. So clearly, this boy had this passion for learning. I actually have a notion, because if you know anything about the historical Jesus, there's nothing written about him from the age of 13 to about 30. Why? Did he stop doing anything interesting? I think there's nothing written about him because I don't think he stayed with his family during that time. I think that when he was 1 year old, that he had these people from the east come and bring him gifts. Remember that part? Usually, if you see a nativity scene, the wise men are there at his birth. They weren't. It was a year later. And they brought him these very valuable gifts. They weren't really for him. He was one. But they were for his parents. And why would wise people come and give gifts to this because of this child? Well, I think they wanted to work a deal. And I think that's what they got, was that when he turned 13, they came and got him. And they carried him off to some other far land in the east, and they trained him. They were called the Magi, which means magic. And my guess is he went and learned much of what he learned from those people, and then later came back to his people in Israel with whole new ideas that they had never heard. And that's where he really got his education. The idea of education and how he created it was that Christian monasteries were actually the precursors to universities. Monasteries are where books were written and kept, and there were great libraries. The major universities, early ones, Cambridge, Oxford, and Harvard, were all Jesus-inspired. They were inspired because they wanted to learn more about Jesus' ability to love and to understand who he was. The first legislation to publicly fund education in the United States was called the Old Deluder-Satan Act. True, Old Deluder-Satan Act. And the purpose of that was based on the idea that every child deserved an education. That came out of Jesus' life, Jesus' experience. Jesus, based on this idea that he saw everyone as a child of God, everyone had the right to learn and to be literate. So education and the advancement of that to all people perhaps started with Jesus. A little different. Let's see what else we got to look at. Compassion. Compassion was not a trait of the ancient world. There were the elites and there were the commoners. And the elites had no interest in being compassionate. So there were people with disease, there were people that were poor, and the elites wanted no part of them. There was no interest in that at all, but Jesus had a great interest in those people. He believed they deserved to be supported and loved, even though they had things that kept them from being like others in their time. So Jesus' compassionate teachings, the things he taught people to do, helped them, or were directed often toward these people that were sick. And the thing that came out of that was this notion of hospitals. See, it was in the early Christian church that, in fact, it was during the Council of Nicaea, the time that the books of the Bible were brought together. That council decreed that anywhere in the world where a Christian church was built, that there would also be a hospice. There would also be a place for the sick to be cared for. That was a requirement in the early Christian days. And that came out of the compassion that this man had for the sick. You know, in the time people, they feigned away from lepers and others that were suffering rather than finding ways to support them. It was a whole new way of being in the world. So that hospitals, and if you'll notice how many hospitals are named after Christian saints and such as that. So the Christian movement really is what pushed that idea of creating medical institutions in the world out of the teachings of Jesus. Humility, courage, wisdom were greatly appreciated in the ancient world, but not humility. Again, we've got the elites and we've got the commoners. The elites had no time for the commoners. They certainly were not going to be humble. You know, they saw the rest of these people as the drudge of the world, nothing important going on there. So, and they saw themselves as special and above it all. So the idea of being humble in any way didn't fit into those cultures. There was a question asked. No, this is not the one about that. Jesus presented himself as the Son of Man. And the idea of that is that he was here to serve humanity. He would wash people's feet. Totally not done in the time. Freaked everybody out when he'd do it. But by doing that, he demonstrated his humility and his ability to not stand above others. Some wanted to call him king. He wasn't interested. That wasn't why he was here. He was here to share his message with the world, not by being better than anyone, but simply by being in service to everyone. So humility really found its foundation in the teachings of Jesus and the way he lived his life. The historian John Dixon wrote, "It is unlikely that any of us would aspire to the virtue of humility were it not for the historical impact of the life of Jesus." Humility from Jesus. Who knew? Forgiveness. Isn't this an interesting one? Forgiveness in the ancient world was not a virtue. Here's the thing that I wanted to share with you. Yeah, there it is. Conan the Barbarian. Heard of him? True historical figure. Was famously asked, "What is best in life?" His answer was to crush your enemies, see them driven down before you, and hear the lamentations of their women. That's the best of life. Jesus had a different take. Oh, I was going to show you that. Okay, there's the thing that I just read to you. Jesus' idea was love your enemies, bless those that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for all those who use you and persecute you. That was totally unheard of. That he brought this idea of loving your enemy, of finding value in those people that find no value in you. Now, we're still teaching this, the idea of forgiveness. We understand that holding a grudge against somebody else doesn't hurt them, it hurts you. We understand that. And we know that by blessing those around you, whether they bless you or not, lifts you up above all of that sticky stuff of life into a better place. Jesus knew it as well, and actually brought forth this notion that we can all live forgiving lives. This is Hannah Arendt. She was a philosopher and the first woman to receive a full professorship at Princeton University. She wrote, "The discoverer of the role of forgiveness in the realm of human affairs was Jesus of Nazareth." That's big. That's profound. And nobody seems to be teaching this stuff. The last one on Jesus' impact on humanity is humanitarian reform. This idea that we should champion the downtrodden. Now, we've already talked about the sick and about children and such as that. But Jesus went even deeper into that notion. He told stories. Many of his lessons related to something that dealt with the downtrodden, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son. And the prodigal son, the son takes his inheritance and goes out and blows it and becomes impoverished and becomes part of the downtrodden and comes back with his tail between his legs to ask for forgiveness from his father. And his father receives him joyously. Wonderful that he was home. Now, his brother wasn't as cool about it. But the teachings and the dynamics in that story are clearly about, no, this one is struggling. We can't turn our backs on them, no matter what. That was what Jesus was teaching to the people in Israel. He was seeing it in a much deeper way than anyone had seen before. Jesus did something that really ticked off a lot of people. He included women in his inner circle. You know, the whole idea of Mary Magdalene being a prophet was garbage. She was one of his disciples. Yet the early church was so focused on male dominance that they couldn't see that, so they had to make her a bad person and make her a lesser than. But historians are pretty clear that Mary Magdalene was none of those things, that she was a woman who was following Jesus and learning from him. Others, of course, say that they were married. I don't know that part. That's conjecture, so I won't go there. But the idea of his support of women, even in a church dominated by men, if you ever would look at the population of Christianity over the centuries, it was dominated by women. Women followed it. Women understood what he was teaching and believed that their lives were better being in that expression. Pretty interesting. And then in Galatians, the Apostle Paul wrote about this idea that we call humanitarian reform. He wrote, "Now there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave or free." Thank you. "Now there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave or free, male or female, but all are one in Christ Jesus." Meaning we're all the same. We're all the same. Is that not a precursor to what we're still trying to do today? And find equity between people of different races, people of different genders, and everything else. It's still something that we're seeking to do, and Jesus believed that, and clearly his follower, Paul, believed it as well. I didn't know a lot of this stuff, so it seemed really important for me to share this with you. Yeah. So it's Christmas. Christmas is next Saturday, and we're going to meet here on Friday night and celebrate the Christ light. In the meantime, take a little time and appreciate that this whole thing of Christmas is not bogus. He really was an amazing presence on earth, still causing us to be better in so many ways. So we'll embrace him in that way. He doesn't have to be your Savior. He doesn't have to be God any more than you or I are. But he is important. So thank you, Jesus. And thank you for your loving attention. I love you all so very much. Thank you.